Thank you, Alec. And all I can say is read China Books Review. It's really a wonderful venture that Alec edits. This is really a marvelous group of people we've assembled here, which I'm very eager to hear what they have to say. And we want to start, before we get to Matt and his book, Boiling Moat, which is in itself really an interesting, a very alarming, and I think somewhat provocative book, but one which, as I read through it, there's very little with which I could disagree, even though I tried. So I encourage you to pick up a copy on your way out and have a read. Now, what we're going to do to start is I thought we know where Matt ended up because he wrote it in a book here. We know what he thinks. We know his state of how he analyzes the threat. But I thought we'd go down the line. We have two people who grew up in China, two who grew up in America, and in just 3 minutes each, describe to us, where did you begin in your attitude towards China? And where have you ended up now? In other words, what is your glide path over the intervening years from when you began to how you see things now under Xi Jinping and the present state of grace? So we're going to just sort of go the logical. We're going to start with Winston, who's really been in this game a long, long time. And I'm wondering, Winston, tell us, when you were about to land in Beijing, what was in your head and how have you changed since then?
Well, let me say I'm delighted to be here, Orville, and I'm glad I'm going first because Orville has assured me that all the mics are being muted, so there won't be any.
These ladies will make outrageous attacks against you, Winston.
My first impression of China really was with a girl from Shanghai who took very good notes in economics class at graduate school. So I became her friend, and we got married, and we had our reception at Twin Oaks in Washington. For most of my life, my attitude toward China and the relationship is that it's sweet and sour. As it get to more recent years, the sour component has begun to take over. I started out with 3 intense periods interacting with the Chinese as a government official. When I first went with Kissinger and Nixon to the opening, we had no illusions about the nature of their society and their system, but it was in our geopolitical interest to open up, and they were weak, so we just saw them as something we'd have to deal with in our national interest. My second encounter was ambassador of the late 1980s, which was the single best period in U.S. China relations and the single most relatively open Chinese atmosphere. Still communist, but when we were there, my wife and I would hold working dinners at the embassy where we'd have dissidents, reformers, communist officials, government officials around the same table talking about political reform. It was the era of Hoover Zhao, 1 step forward and reform, 2 steps back. Our relations were excellent, both in combating the Soviets and balancing, but also improving our trade, investment, exchanges of all kinds across the Pacific. So that was a hopeful period. I left just the first big demonstration of Tiananmen Square, Hu Yaobang's funeral. 100,000 people turned out. But even with the sinking of our relationship because of Tiananmen Square, I still felt hopeful about China because, after all, contrary to sort of a lot of people's impression, it wasn't just demonstrations by students in Beijing. It was in 300 cities, people from all walks of life. And so it seemed to me that there was this groundswell that would take over in the future. I was not naive. I never, throughout this transaction of my journey during these decades, I never assumed they were going to become a Jeffersonian democracy, but I had hope, as many others did. In the 1990s, mid-90s, I was assistant secretary, and we reconstructed the relationship after Tiananmen. And then into the early 2000s, still sweet and sour as always, but some hope. After all, the Chinese were cooperating with us to a certain degree on North Korea, on Iran, on Afghanistan. Exchanges and trade were going up. We had continuing problems And even in 2008, which I think was sort of the beginning of the turning point, Liu Xiaobo, and I recommend the review of his biography that Orville has done. It's fantastic. I came out with Charter 8, ironically, in 2008, the same year the Olympics, and the same year the Chinese began to feel their oats because they saw how the West had messed up the international financial system. They got through it pretty well. So then, during really the Obama administration, and I think their correct pivot to Asia, which I give more credit to than Matt does and others, but it wasn't enough, but it was the beginning. I began to see what was happening. And so to conclude this journey, clearly my views, along with I think most people who follow China, certainly a China task force that Orville co-chairs and all members were not raging hawks or panda huggers for that matter, it's sort of in the middle, but we've all moved, I think, and Orville can correct me, toward a much more firmer and pessimistic view of the Chinese. So today I see them genuinely as a strategic rival. I agree with Matt and Gallagher's analysis in foreign affairs of the threat. I have some disagreement on how to respond to it, but basically the need for a greater firmness, the fact that there's more sour in that sweet and sour mix, in my perception, is where I am today. Now, I end up by saying, seems to be the big question in my attitudes and our relations is going to be how much of the trouble, which I believe is due to Xi, aggressiveness abroad, repression at home, meddling in other societies, how much is that Xi specific and how much is that communist Chinese DNA? And in other words, what's going to happen when Xi leaves? Can we get back to a more manageable relationship? I do not know the answer to that question. I don't think anyone else does either. Thank you.
Jianying, you grew up in Beijing, and tell us your odyssey.
Well, I think elsewhere I've sort of described myself and my generation of Chinese as sort of the engagement generation, because we really grow up with, this sort of hope that China will become more democratic. But the whole arc of our generation actually started way before the engagement, of course. To say that we're a generation of the Cultural Revolution and Maoism, is enough to know, to say what I mean. But I think I told this story before that I was shoveling snow as a high school girl in Beijing, so that in Nixon's historical visit, Nixon and Winston could get to the Great Wall in the bitter winter of Beijing, and that was where...
Thank you very much, I appreciate it.
It was so spotlessly clean because we worked the night before. There was a blizzard, but that was where I would say the moment of hope that sort of germinated for a lot of us, because we could see suddenly there's a crack of light in this sort of iron house, you might say. I mean, we had a lot of abstract sort of hostility towards Americans from the movies, from this propaganda that we were schooled on, but we never met any real Americans until you guys showed up. So after that, I think we went through this sort of very romantic decade in the 1980s, when China truly opened up, and there were so many, real engagement, not just officially, but among the people, and I was one of the first batch of students who came to the States. So that was, really looking back, the golden era that a lot of us had great hope about what China could become and what U.S. China relations could become. Then you began to see the darkening in the 1990s when China began to, really sort of rise economically without, the political reform after Tiananmen. So, for those of us who thought the U.S. was an icon for not just wealth and power, but, democracy and freedom, that was the first shift. There's a new generation of Chinese, I think, who really saw U.S. as this, model for wealth and competition. And then it went sort of further and further in the last 10 years with Xi Jinping coming in, crushing civil society, labeling all these, sort of liberal-minded Chinese people as potential traitors. So I think the last 10 years, a lot of us who were gradualist, reformist Chinese have become more pessimistic. So I'm just briefly saying, for my generation of Chinese, a lot of us have sort of walked this arc from hope to, disappointment to pessimism. Of course, I'm myself is kind of surprised to read. I was reading Matt's book and I was tearing through this book, which I began to think, well, this is going to be so hawkish, and I don't know. But then, like Orville, I find myself, well, I'm not boiling yet, but I feel simmering, because really it's resonance with so much of simmering, like a simmering pot, because it's a slow boil. A lot of us had this patient sort of reformist attitude about the potential of China changes. But now I think we really feel like you need something much harder. You can't just have hope and not backed up by real will to stand up to this rollback of totalitarianism under Xi Jinping.
Zoe.
First of all, thank you, Orville, for inviting me. And it's truly a great honor and a pleasure to share the podium with people who created the history that I only get to read in a history book. By saying that, I wanted to start with a personal story. I grew up in an era where I consider myself and my generation as the poster children generation of U.S. China engagement. And Orville, you and I had a conversation about how interesting that in Chinese language there is very hard to find an exact translation of what engagement means in Chinese. And when Ambassador Lord talked about the sweet-sour moment or the relationship in U.S. China relationship, it reminded me of a dish that I did not know existed until I came over to America in 2011. That dish is sweet and sour, and it is called General Tso's chicken. Trust me, I never know. It is a Chinese dish until I came over to America.
I think he was a Kuomintang general.
So I think it captures, through these two little examples, I wanted to say that somehow a lot of these anecdotes, these stories, these piecemeals seems to reflect the bigger kind of mismatch between the United States and China, and how perhaps the perceptions on both sides would be different, either because of the loss of translation, because of the mismatch of the languages, or sometimes its intention may matter less when it compared with perceptions. And I wanted to go back to the personal story, which is, I grew up in a family where, as one child generation, and my grandpa happened to fought the Japanese during the anti-Japanese war, during the World War II era, and then he was on the communist side fighting the Civil War, and he fought the Americans in the Korean War. And from where I grew up, the history that I learned through elementary school to college, that period of war, we do not call it the Korean War. We call it anti-American supporting Korea war. I think, again, this is this perception is quite interesting. And my grandpa, somebody who fought through this, and obviously he was purged during the Cultural Revolution and so on and so forth. So I grew up with this gentleman, and he told me when I was little. I'm pretty sure that was before I went to elementary school. He told me that, hey, Zongyuan, when you get the chance, you should go to the beautiful empirical country to study. And at that time, in Chinese, I remember that because he said so many times, 如果有机会，你以后要去美帝国主义学习. For somebody, he fought the Americans, and he considered, the narrative in his era, the Soviet was the big brother. He encouraged me to go to study in the beautiful empirical country instead of going to Soviet Union or Russia. Never, ever, he ever said that. And I think that's very interesting coming from somebody like him. So indeed, I consider myself as my generation, as the poster child generation of engagement. And if people say, again, depending upon how we measure the object, the success, how we define the success or failure of engagement, at least if you see people like me, you see people like in my generation, and perhaps the parents the parents in China today, if you ask them, are you going to send your children to study in Russia, or if options are given, would you want to send your children to study in America? I'm pretty sure that the answer would be coming to study in America. And the reason I say that is because most of the parents today, and the government is trying so hard to encourage this generation, like my generation of people, to have not just one child, but 3 children. And this happens to be the generation where you consider themselves as the success or the poster children generation of engagement. And I would say that the limit of our generation is that we grew up in such hope that my parents' generation, my grandpa generation, they sacrificed so much so that we do not have to sacrifice. So that we grew up in an era, as many people say, that these are the spoiled generation, this is the 颓废的80后. And I think, now I started to say, we started to project ourselves to the Gen Z generation. But again, you started to realize that this generation, they never lived through something like zero COVID. And this is something that I'm afraid going forward, the emotional scar of zero COVID, the idea that suddenly things can just snap closed just like that. I'm afraid that the political repercussions inside of the Chinese community has not been fully played out yet. And this is exactly why I think I'm going to probably quote President Bush in his when Ambassador Lord was in China. This is when Tiananmen happened. I think a lot of domestic pressure happened here in the United States. But I think American government at that time decided that this is going to be such a dangerous moment and a disaster to humanity if we turn China and if we allow the Communist Party of China to close itself to the rest of the world. And I hope that whatever we are doing today is not to push the Communist Party of China to close the 1.4 billion population country again.
Thank you. So Matt, when you went to China writing for the Wall Street Journal, and you can begin before that if you want, what was in your head? How did you look at China? And then we'll get to the end about how you look at it now.
Yeah, Orville. So I went to a high school in Massachusetts, which was one of the few high schools in the 80s that taught Chinese. And I was getting my butt kicked in Spanish class. And I remember my father, who I just spotted, my mother and father are both here. I think you know my father, Stan Pottinger.
I was a classmate of your father's at college.
Exactly. So I said, I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I've got this just tough Spanish teacher. I'm not really good at Spanish, and I'm not really enjoying it. And just then I saw the Chinese teacher coming across the quad. My father said, "You guys have Chinese here?" He's like, "Well, of course you got to study Chinese. China's going to be, the next century is going to be maybe China's century. This is going to be a huge." So he had the insight, and I took Chinese and fell in love with the language. I was actually better at it than I was at Spanish anyway. And when and I signed up to do a high school exchange in Beijing. And we were getting our briefings, and I had a stamp from the People's Republic of China visa in my passport. And just as we were getting ready to go, martial law was declared, 1989. And so I had to postpone my first experience in China, but ended up spending a lot of the 1990s there, again as a student, and then writing for Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. And it was a wonderful time. It wasn't as open, I think, Jianying, as the 80s. had been, but there was still this hope that had not died, that, as Beijing would liberalize the economy, somehow, somewhere, something was going to happen politically, something more pluralistic, something more liberal than what we're seeing right now. And we were disappointed, I think.
I just want to footnote, I want you to answer it later. Were we naive? But go on.
Sure. So I remember over the course of my time reporting, I covered all these World Trade Organization negotiations that were going on. I'd be chasing Charlene Barshevsky and Pascal Lamy from the European Union as we they negotiated China's accession into the World Trade Organization. But it became clear certainly within a couple of years of China entering in 2001, that the explosion of reforms that had led up to that point did not continue. In fact, they sort of plateaued under the Hu Jintao era. And then under Xi Jinping, when he came into power, it really went into reverse. And I do remember, I should mention James Mann's writing. That's when I first learned about Winston Lord, who I really admired, reading about your time as ambassador to China, because you were attempting to speak to the Chinese people and to disintermediate the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese Communist Party wouldn't have any of that. They made you wear small shoes, to use the phrase, because you were trying to reach out to students directly and others. And that should have been a clue for us. The Tiananmen Massacre was more than a clue. I think that we probably were too optimistic of what could be assumed about the trajectory of China. James Mann went on, after he wrote the book about face, he wrote a book called The China Fantasy. And he was ridiculed for writing that book. It was a short, very, very tight book filled with insight. I remember reading that after I had left China and joined the Marine Corps, and I remember just it crystallizing for me so many of the observations that hadn't fully congealed into a sort of framework for understanding Beijing. I think he nailed it. He really saw around the corner with that book. But to Winston's question, how much of this is in the DNA of the party versus Xi Jinping? A lot of people in China who still have a sense of humor and satire and hope sometimes refer to him, when they can get away with it online, as 总加速师. 总加速师means the great accelerator. And I think that they don't mean that as a compliment, but I do think that in many senses, he is an accelerator of the worst impulses that the party has had sort of in its heart going back to its founding, or certainly to the founding of the People's Republic.
Do you think China is receptive to overtures at this point to change the manner in which it deports itself in Asia and the world? And do you think what he is saying is something that's worth pursuit, that can be pursued, and that has any possibility of creating a more constructive and peaceful end?
I really gave it a shot when I was in office. Remember, the first job I had before I was Deputy National Security Advisor, I was the Senior Director for Asia. So I was really trying to coordinate the U.S. policy on Asia, including China. And I remember I made an approach to the Chinese government to see whether or not we could find certain areas where we could cooperate, where I thought it was in the interest of both of our country's people and really in the interest of humankind. That was the things I proposed was pandemic preparedness. This is in 2018, okay? It was anti-terrorism, counter drugs. It included environmental work, right? It included counter-proliferation. It became very clear to me after we made this overture that Beijing viewed this as an opportunity to acquire or extract concessions in areas wholly unrelated to those areas that I thought we should try to hive off and protect, irrespective of whether the bilateral relationship was moving up or down or sideways. It became very clear to me that there was no sincere desire to actually make progress on those issues, but actually to try to, again, use have us make other concessions as sort of an admission ticket to be able to work on things that we thought were in both countries' interests. So I did not. I think that through experience, not from things I read or preconceived notions I had, I just couldn't make progress even after trying. And as I learned more about my predecessors in these roles, it looked like the pattern was pretty well set and here to stay, particularly under the current dictator.
You know, maybe let's hear from our two Chinese participants. How do you look at your country now in terms of the possibilities? If you were doing things differently and had control of policy, do you think there's something you could do that would change in effect, what Winston did in 1972, which was really to change the terms of the game?
I had a little help.
Well, you had a little help, but you were present at the creation of that hopeful interlude we're talking about. But how do you two now look at your own society and your own country in terms of a different route pathway?
Let me go just briefly first. Before I start, I wanted to say just one thing about that outburst. By the way, Matt, I'm sorry, I'm also from Columbia. Columbia University. Columbia University was my graduate school in the 1980s. In fact, Edward Said was the chairman of my department. But I was also saying C.T. Xia was my advisor. So I have, sort of was exposed to both the leftist and the right, the conservative politics.
To put it in Chinese Communist Party language.
The language, yeah, because these labels are ridiculous. I mean, they're confusing and misleading out of context. But I was going to say that outburst reminds me of many things that I heard. There's a term for that kind of position or voice called tankers. I'm sure there are people in the audience who know that term, tankers. I can't remember, the tankies. That's a tanky. It's coming out of something related to the tanks. In the East, maybe it's Soviets rolling out the tanks in Hungary, or it's Tiananmen tanks. And it's related to whataboutism, if you know that. So what about us? What about America? We have all these problems, so that, China. I'm afraid these are the people who maybe have certain notions about a society that they have never lived in, and they project the walls of their suffering at home onto a perfect other that they have no idea. I mean, of course, I'm just one voice, but as I said, I have lived in both worlds, and I have lived in China in an extreme version of that. And people could say, Cultural Revolution, that's pre-reform. Deng Xiaoping changed all that, and Mao is long dead. No, Mao never died. As a notion, as a founding father, he's never dead. And China's, this ugly old, head has reared itself. As you said, the DNA in the seed. It's just a new matter. It's like people say, this is not Cultural Revolution now. No, there's no way. No, it's not, but it's upgraded Cultural Revolution version 2 with high tech. High tech is give wings to this ancient totalitarian, culture that was from 2,000 years ago. The legalism and people talk about, Confucianism. There's another darker legacy from the Chinese governance model embodied in legalism, in certain strand of Taoism. I don't want to go on and on about that, but I'm just saying the current manifestation of the China we see is sort of an amalgamism of all that tradition, and at its darkest, you really cannot have illusions about that. It's, of course, the worst victim of this reversion under Xi Jinping. The worst victims are Chinese themselves, but they're part of the party state that's been hijacked into this narrative as if it's one. It's the spokesman of the people. It's not, because I was one of the people for a long time under Mao. We thought We're the voice of the people. We are going to anti-American imperialism, anti-West. We're Chinese. We're embodiment of this legacy, and that's why in the last 10 years you have this fierce and insidious discourse in China that's bringing back all that Chinese nationalism and saying that this is a rejuvenation of China again. Now we're wealthy, we need to stand up to the West. We need to say no. No, it's much more complicated than that. So I'm going on. I could go on and on about this, but I don't know if I addressed your question. But I'm just one Chinese, and I know I'm not alone. I have so many fellow Chinese liberals, though we also, of course, become polarized. I would say since the U.S. election in 2016, a lot of us who were labeled as beaconites, those of Chinese liberals who viewed America as a beacon of hope, we were polarized about how to deal with China, how to look at the problems America is going through. But there's one thing that we are united, that have no illusions about what this China is right now. It's not an embodiment of the Chinese people. You have to have a realistic solution, or at least management to cope with it.
You mentioned the word solution. So I would like us to maybe talk for a moment, because Matt's written this book, which is largely about dealing with one of the most complicated and dangerous problems on earth, namely Taiwan. So is there a solution to this problem that is other than you have described it, Matt, which is basically this needs to be deterred?
It looked for a long time like this would be something that could be creatively managed, right?
And it was.
And it was, right? Deng Xiaoping created this idea of one country, two systems as a way to pull Hong Kong back into Chinese sovereignty after a colonial period under British rule. And there was a promise that there would be a separate rule of law, a high degree of autonomy, features of a democratic system that would live on in Hong Kong. And Deng Xiaoping always said that he pushed that model forward, having Taiwan ultimately in mind. Xi Jinping has very different ideas about this. He has short-circuited the Sino-British treaty that was supposed to guarantee a high degree of autonomy and to preserve that one country, two systems for Hong Kong. That system's now dead for Hong Kong. People in Taiwan decided to vote now 3 times in a row for the party that is less inclined to move towards some kind of a modus vivendi as part of the People's Republic of China, partly in response to how Hong Kong was treated. So when you talk about this word solution, it makes me nervous, because Xi Jinping, when he talks about Taiwan, he talks about it as a problem that needs to be solved. 解决台湾问题. What we're trying to do, I think, is actually preserve a status quo until such time as the people of Taiwan and the people of mainland China have both the means, they do already in Taiwan, but not yet in China, to decide what kind of future they want to have together, if they want to have that future together. In the meantime, we preserve the status quo. Xi Jinping is not looking to preserve the status quo. He's not worried that Taiwan is going to declare independence. He is declaring that Taiwan must move actively closer to China and ultimately be part of the People's Republic of China. He told that much to President Biden when they met in San Francisco in just a few months back, right, in November. He said it's all, according to a senior administration official from the U.S. side, Xi Jinping said, peace is all well and good, but at some point we need to move forward to resolve this problem, to solve it. And that told me that Xi Jinping is now threatening, he's basically saying that peace is less important to him than changing the status quo to fit his vision.
I do think that in particular, the perception, again, I'm going to talk about perception. I think the concern about, to go back directly to the question about, the possibility of war, I do see worries from folks here in the United States, where I now live, and I'm a naturalized citizen. And I also see the other side of the story from China's point of view, in the sense that if we just do a back of the envelope calculation, according to the World Health Organization, the WHO, by 2040, 2045, the population, the demographic picture in China is going to be completely different, to the extent that by 2024, 2045, in other words, in the next 2 decades, the age of Chinese people who is above 60 years old is going to be somewhere around 420 million. And at the same time, the US population, the entirety of the US population by that time, the entirety of the US population is going to be somewhere around 380 million. In other words, the demographic part of the equation is not really in China's favor economically, or for that matter, to quote President Xi Jinping, to solve the Taiwan problem is not necessarily in China's favor. Now, if we try to do the kind of like a game theory or cost-benefit analysis, if President Xi Jinping and the current Chinese government leader or Communist Party of China, the policy priority is to prioritize economic growth, then we would have to solve the problem of, again, Econ 101, technology, resources, and human capital, right? On the one hand, the tech aspect of that is probably the window, the free access to or low-cost access to Western advanced market in terms of low-cost R&D. That window is narrowing and narrowing, and we can debate why that is narrowing. But if we take a look at the demographic aspect of it, one child policy and the lack of social security support, and the general environment about why women are discouraged to have children, and so on and so forth. The high cost or the arms race of education in China, the same as elsewhere. And a lot of this is not necessarily contributing to, instead of you guys having, the 80s, the 80后having one child, how about you guys have 3 children? That is not going to happen anytime soon. In other words, I think, the Communist Party of China viewing this issue as, especially the demographic aspect of it, is a issue that cannot be resolved anytime soon. So I think.
Well, the question is, are any of these things going to change the frame of mind of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping, which might make them more open to some kind of resolution? And
could I get back to the Taiwan issue? The quick answer is there is no solution, as you said. You do have to manage it through deterrence. I would say also through reassurance, that we're not upsetting principles we've agreed to going back to 72, but above all, deterrence, which the book lays out very effectively. It seems to me that there's going to be no peaceful unification willing on the part of Taiwan unless China changes its political system. Even the most forthcoming Chinese leaders like President Ma and so on, they weren't about to get close to China unless the political system changes. Hong Kong has made that amply clear. Every poll shows 87% for the status quo, a few percentages for unification, a few for independence. So the Taiwan people don't want to rock the boat with provocation, but they certainly don't want to get close to China with that system. So given that, and given Xi and China's principle, there's no solution. You manage it and you deter. Now, it's conceivable, if you try to stretch for an in-principle solution, 25 years from now, post-Xi, a different Chinese government, you could have a confederation, so like the British Commonwealth. You could play around with those formulas. But in the meantime, it is obviously an extremely dangerous situation. I commend Matt's book, and it's detailed in what we should be doing. It draws a lot of people who had actual military service, which is really, really crucial. But I would end up with a question to Matt, because I was surprised by one thing in the book. You conclude essentially, although invasion is very difficult, as you point out, you seem to think that's more likely than gray area or blockades or messing around with an outside, because it seems to me the chances of an invasion, whatever Xi's pronouncements, whatever their objectives, is somewhere between 1% and 2% in the next 10 or 20 years. And you point a lot of this out in your book. I mean, first of all, we had, in World War II, we had 20 miles to cross, and that was pretty tough for D-Day. This is 100 miles, very rough water, few beaches, urban warfare. The fact that Xi's out of power if he loses, the impact on the Chinese economy, the deterrence, the danger of the U.S. intervening, the deterrence of conflict, the fact that other countries, including Japan and South Korea and Australia, are getting more involved. The fact that the military has obviously got some problems because he's firing everybody for corruption and they're not in great shape, it seems to be. They haven't fought a war since '79 in Vietnam. You put all these things together, and I just don't see him trying an invasion, even if he wanted to. The final point is, if he invades, and even if it succeeds, it's like the dog chasing the car and finally catching up with it. What the hell you do then? You got guerrilla warfare in the streets and in the mountains. You got the computer chip industry destroyed, probably. And so he's occupying Taiwan with the whole world upset.
Yeah.
So I just don't see an invasion. So I'm very surprised that you think that's more likely than a gray area, which is much tougher to respond to.
I think gray area is already happening. I think there's 100% likelihood.
Well, I mean gray area like blockade and pick off an island.
So blockade is technically an act of war. My assumption, and my co-authors and I state clearly that this is only an assumption. We don't know exactly how Xi Jinping is going to try to skin this thing. But our view is that if Xi Jinping is not confident that he could win a full invasion, he's less likely to even embark on a blockade, because what if the blockade doesn't work? Blockades are hard, right? Countries don't frequently submit to a blockade. You have lots of examples where people just run the blockade. They find ways to make their food supplies to hold out longer, or fashion, save on their energy and so forth, and ration. So if he does a blockade and Taiwan doesn't submit, then he's in a real bind. At that point, he either needs to escalate further to an invasion, or he needs to admit defeat. So we think that if Taiwan, the United States, Japan, particularly those three working together, have a credible ability and have demonstrated that we've got will to come to Taiwan's defense, it's much less likely that the blockade scenario is going to happen. Now, I do think that a quarantine, there's a distinction here. It might fit in your gray zone sort of framework, and I think you're probably right. A quarantine it's sort of a sleight of hand, right? This is what President Kennedy did because he didn't want to declare war against Khrushchev when the Soviets were bringing missiles and to Cuba. So he declared a quarantine, which was basically a very limited type of blockade that says we're only going to stop certain contraband from coming in. Luckily, Khrushchev blinked. Had he not blinked, I'm not sure how this thing would have played out. It could have been pretty ugly pretty quickly. Luckily, he did blink, and we made private concessions part of the way of making that happening. Bobby Kennedy negotiated to remove those intermediate range missiles from Turkey and so forth. So I do think that that's possible because Beijing has more flexibility to impose a quarantine selectively, not for a long period of time. Maybe it does it for a week as sort of an exercise or a police action but what they're doing is constantly moving the bar higher and higher. They're slicing this salami to make it much, much tougher for Taiwan over the long term. I do think that there's a significant probability that Beijing moves to something like a quarantine.
So let me ask all of you, do you see Xi Jinping as a person who blinks? I mean, that's a very important question because if you read him as someone with very thin skin, who takes umbrage easily and feels very deeply aggrieved, these kinds of people tend not to blink.
Yeah, so there's a phrase, 走一步算一步, which means he's someone who will take a step but then look and calculate very carefully before taking another step. I don't think he's a reckless gambler. But he doesn't like to blink, but he's done it. He blinked on zero COVID that Zoe was talking about. That was an incredible about face where he had been quite firm all the way up through the party Congress in 2022 that he will continue with the zero COVID policy that mandated rolling lockdowns of city after city, Shanghai most dramatically because there was some ability to get media images out of Shanghai, just how locked down it was. In the end, he reversed himself. I don't think he had any intention to reverse himself at that point. But the pressures were simply growing too immense. The strain of COVID that began circulating, Omicron, was too infectious and too wily to be able to contain, whereas he had been able to successfully contain less infectious strains. So he did a U-turn. Zoe might agree, I don't know what your view is of whether he is doing a U-turn right now on property and remember he had a 3 red lines policy to make it much harder for people to speculate on property. Those policies are melting away before our eyes because the economy is in such a bad bind. So it's not impossible for him to blink.
And yet, it seems to me that one of the things, and I'd like to get all of your views on this, there is this idea of hostile foreign forces, which doesn't enter the property market, for instance, that if you believe, as it seems he does, that there is a fundamental contradiction between what China's for, he's for, and all of these hostile foreign forces outside, then it raises in question any kind of a solution on almost anything. And I wonder how you look at that and where it came from and is it abiding?
Well, this is why Mike Gallagher and I wrote that piece in Foreign Affairs a couple of months ago, where we thought that the policy that remember, there are many aspects of President Biden's policy on China that I've been supportive of. I think it represented continuity in many ways from the Trump era. The problem is Xi Jinping is now waging proxy wars, okay? I mean, Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, went to Beijing in April and said Beijing is overwhelmingly the number one supporter, material as well as diplomatic and propaganda supporter, but material supporter of the biggest war in Europe since World War II. He's also the biggest material supporter, Xi Jinping, the party, of Iran, which is sponsoring all these terror groups that are doing their worst, not just Hamas. And so I think that you're looking at a policy that is outdated now. I'd say that even President Trump's policy, which was good for the moment, and Biden's policy probably was working for the first couple of years that he was in office, is now been made obsolete by the fact that Beijing is moving forward, waging war through proxies in multiple theaters of the world right now. And look at what's happening at the Philippines, where Beijing's directly putting immense pressure on Philippine sailors trying to take these little islets just offshore from the Philippines, even though, in violation of international law and international court rulings. So that calls for a different policy that has to be updated to recognize that a détente-style policy is not going to be effective in deterring this kind of behavior because we're seeing it play out in real time. Therefore, you have to start thinking a little more like George Kennan. You have to think a little bit more like Harry Truman. You have to think a little bit more like Ronald Reagan, all of whom said in their own ways that you have to rob Beijing of the sources of its aggression. They were talking about the Soviet Union, but it's the same type of party. It's this Leninist system. And that means that we should not be, first of all, do no harm. Don't do things that make it easier for Beijing to acquire the technology or the cash that system needs to build an even more fearsome military, to build even more fearsome weapons. So that's really the point that we were trying to make.
It seems to me he's going to be a hard man to make blink, but it's never going to happen if we get our own act together. He's got to be tempted, as are other countries, by the disarray in this country politically, the polarization, the toxicity. I don't want to get political here, but at least the challenge to our democracy. And unless we can fix our own system, we can't invest in hard power effectively, the Congress passes it. I think Biden's gotten a few things through on chips and infrastructure and so on that are helpful, but we can't compete effectively if we don't have our act together for hard power. And obviously, as a model of soft power and competing ideologically in world order, if we're in total disarray, we can't compete either. So to me, the key to China policy, and I think Biden has at least recognized that in principle, is it begins at home. It's true of foreign policy in general. Mm-hmm. Then you move to your allies, and I do think he's done a good job in the various pieces he's put together in Asia. I won't take time enumerating them all, not to mention Ukraine. So I think, like any bully, he will blink if it's in his self-interest to blink, and if he's up against formidable competition. So it does require a firm policy. Now, it doesn't, however, require hysteria. And I would argue that some elements of Congress are hysterical, and cutting off exchanges that are in our self-interest, exchanges, whether it's of scientists or students, there may be 1% security problem, but you don't use machetes for exchanges, you use scalpels where there's real security problems. And I mean, we ought to be keeping Chinese scientists and others. So there's got to be some nuances. I think it's got to be a firm policy. There's got to be some nuances. Then finally, and this is what is sad, is you can't even get the Chinese now to work on global problems. They're not doing us a favor to work on climate change or non-proliferation or artificial intelligence, which we haven't even mentioned, which is the single biggest problem we have, or future pandemics. That's in their interest, in global interest. And as you point out, we shouldn't have to pay a price to get their cooperation. It can't be solved with our two countries cooperating, and it's in their national interest. So it's a real challenge. So we haven't effectively answered your question. I think we're all saying it's a tough guy to make blink. But I think if we get our act together and we get the leverage of friends and allies around the world, he's got North Korea, Iran, and Russia. We've got everybody else except the global south.
Can I make a point about that, by the way? Just very briefly. I looked at just the back of the envelope the other day. Do you know what the cumulative GDP is of all of the U.S. and its treaty allies? Okay, these are all the democracies that we have a defense treaty with. It's NATO, it's Canada, it's Japan and South Korea and Australia and a couple others. Together, we have a $60 trillion a year economy, okay? Russia is $2 trillion a year. Are you kidding me that we can't handle as a alliance system Russia's last gasp, grasping for empire? I think we can handle it if we don't lose our nerve, take stock of the actual latent power that we have available. If you add China, if you add the other axis of chaos members, that's North Korea, it's China, it's Iran. I'd throw in Venezuela and Cuba for good measure. If you add all of those together, it's still only about a third together of the $60 trillion of the democracies. We're psyching ourselves out with bad arguments and a bit of fatalism, I think.
I wanted to say about the blink. This is too ticklish to say. I feel Xi Jinping is a blinker. I feel he blinks a lot. The most obvious time is what Matt said, the sudden turnaround of zero COVID. But if you really look closely, he blinked many times. But these are, calculated, I think like Winston said, all around one issue, which is whether it's going to threaten his power, his own power. And I would say his character can be summed up in just this Chinese 4 characters. 又怂又狠. Both cowardly and ruthless. And these combinations are manifested many times. For example, one anecdote, when he was hosted by Trump in the White House, and Trump served a chocolate cake at the end of the dinner and said, Mar-a-Lago, and say, we lobbed, by the way, I just want you to know, we lobbed a bunch of tomahawks, and right after that dinner, he came home with this, in the media and everybody, all the liberals, of course, were fooled by this, He's saying we have 1,000 reasons to have good relations with America and not one single reason to have bad one. So everybody thought, oh my God, he blinked. I mean, he's going to turn around. But later, he recuperated from that shock. And he realized, okay, this is actually, not going to threaten. He's going to not lob, missiles on me. And so, the hardcore of him is as long as he feels he's not threatened in power, he's ruthless about anything. He could go this proxy wars, yes, because that's a coward way of fighting. But if you push come to shove, this is so much in the DNA of a brand of Chinese Communist Party that they really only recognize force. To put it crudely, a punch in the face. They really know this is no good. This is the limit. But I'm not advocating, only military because, we should I think Americans are smart power. We have so many ways of doing this. Technology, diplomacy, cultural, educational. You have the whole range. But the military, I agree with that one point. I think it was in the opening of Matt's book, that it has to be backed. When you're dealing with a foe like this, a wily, cowardly, and ruthless foe, you have to be, the soft power has to be backed by deterrence, which is backed, guaranteed by military power.
Let me ask you all this question, which I think is on the mind, certainly of those people who interrupted us, and on the minds of many others who would be critics of this rather hard line that we've developed here. What about provocation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We saw this with Putin and NATO. We provoked him into doing this. You made me do it. How do we analyze the role of our harder line being so provocative that we stir?
Yeah. Let me take this first.
Okay.
Because Matt, you've done your part of the service, and first of all, I wanted to begin this part by saying that, Matt, thank you very much for service. For many of us, probably already know that you are not only a journalist, a China scholar, you've also served in the Marine. Thank you for your service.
Thanks. Thank you.
And to follow, I do think that among all the people that around the world who tend to confuse China as if it is unitary actor, at least we know that nobody here confuses China as if it is just a one organic unit. So people tend to, at least Matt and Ambassador Lord, obviously Orville and Jianying, myself included, we recognize the different part of China, both in terms of party, the role of party, the government, the people, and even the central government, the local government, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of understanding the provocation part, I do think that there are two sides of the coin in the sense that, again, I wanted to say, like, Matt, you are going to be such an expensive marriage counselor that I can never afford, and I never wanted to have one, okay? So the idea that, you really described this, not just in terms of how the two, in terms of cross-street relationship, or for that matter, U.S. China relationship. I tend to think that this is, in a way, like a marriage. My mentor, Professor David Lempton, he described the U.S. China relationship, Sinbad two dreams. And in that 同床异梦. And I think this is we are still in a way very much in that scenario, in the sense that, again, the kind of like the John Pomfret, right, about the missionary posture or the expectation that we had since the beginning of the missionary generation went to China and so on and so forth. But the two sides of the coin is that on the one, it's really about action and reaction. And I just tend to, again, thank you for your service, Matt. And I just wanted to raise that again because your service, your experience reminded me of a quote, and I believe it's in English, which is, let me try to say this right. It is said like this: generals always fight the last war. And for a lot of us a lot of people here and the generation who created the history in terms of, we had a romantic, a perfect idealized version of where China is supposed to be. Whether China is going, the whole idea of the rising GDP, democratization, and so on and so forth, different versions of that. I think, again, right now we are unfortunately locked in this era where both sides are thinking about each other with the worst intentions. It's like it's like sometimes when I had a conversation, my husband is not going to be happy with this, but when I disliked what he does, I would think about why you are doing this, and I forget all the things I love about him, and I started to like, you are the worst person. You are doing this with the worst intention. I'm afraid that a lot of the reactions from both countries are pushing each other. Forget about a lot of the good, the benefit of working together, and instead we focus on the cost of engagement, or for that matter, the weaponization of interdependence. And the more we are doing this, we are locking ourselves in the Cold War scenario, and trapping ourselves in a Cold War scenario preclude better outcomes. And we are seeing that China view itself from a position of vulnerability. It is trying to reduce a lot of the strategic vulnerabilities by developing alternative systems for trade, for finance, for a lot of things. And what I am afraid is that if China were able to scale up a lot of these alternatives, we are going to lose our deterrence power, whether it is a sanction, whether it is something else.
Well, Zoe, I think you've pointed out that this is a very interactive relationship. But in every interaction, there is a prime mover. And I'm wondering, did America set this thing off, or did China? Because once it gets rolling, it gets a logic of its own. In other words, what have we done wrong that we should do better and right that we have not done?
I would say that at least from I'm a econ finance person, so I wanted to put on the econ side. I do think that we did not set the expectations correctly when we invited China to join the WTO, and I think the lessons there learned is that we misunderstood the way that China does conduct business. We are here, we do business in the West is very much like we formalize the contract, we sign the contract, that we are expected to influence. There is a contract enforcement, we have contract lawyer and so on and so forth. America is very much a litigation culture, whereas in China, no, this is not the way we do business. All right, it's like we sign a contract in a banquet after a cup of white wine or like baijiu or wine, and sometimes we call it like 三中全会. You start with beer, you move on to wine, and then you drink the hard liqueur. You conclude by some dessert wine, things like that. And by the end of the day, you probably don't even know what you signed up. And then you started to figure out what we are eventually going to do. And that raised a lot of the concerns in the sense that on the one hand, China is not necessarily doing a lot, at least on the business front. You are not enforcing the contract. And B, China learned as China become a more and more understanding the WTO rules. China started to become clever, using WTO rules not just to enforce domestic reform, but also trying to sue sue other countries. So I think here, to begin with, I do not think we set the behavior correctly. We did not let China and the Chinese business community understand, or the state-owned enterprises to understand this is how we do business. Instead, I think we followed the practice, which is, from American business point of view, technology, market in exchange for technology in exchange for market access. But now things have reversed.
No, listen,
can I
Jianying, before Matt had something to say, and then we'll come back.
Go ahead, Jianying.
I was just gonna, because I heard this argument, this counter argument about the WTO and all this different. Just play the devil's advocate for one moment. Why did all these other cultures, let's just cite Asian, who joined WTO, like South Korea, like Singapore and all these, why did they all have the so-called Confucian cultures, banquet and all this, old culture, right? A contract is a contract. When you sign onto a contract, how come it did not happen to these other countries? They end up, in the process, develop a sort of a rule of law. This is called modernizing your own country. your culture. And this is the aspiration of the vast majority of Chinese too. That we didn't learn how to do this, but
time is running out.
This is the only country I'm saying will end up this way. I'm blaming the Americans.
Zoe, give us 2 sentences on that.
Matt, you had something to say?
No, I was going to actually respond to your first question, which was about, how do you avoid provoking?
And are you provocative, Matt? That's the question.
So look, this is a. It's going to sound counterintuitive because it's paradoxical. This is something I didn't know when I was a reporter. It's something I learned as a Marine. It's something I learned from reading history. But if you look at, I would commend one book to the 3 guys, who started screaming at me. A book by Geoffrey Blaney, who is a historian in Australia, called The Causes of War, where he investigated what the real causes were of all the wars of the last 400 years. And incredibly, some of the similar findings were found by a Yale and Oxford historian named Michael Howard. There was a British historian named Evan Luard, who was pointed out to me by Corey Shackey at the American Enterprise Institute. They all studied hundreds of years of wars. They found some things that would surprise you. They surprised me, and I write about them in chapter 3 of the book. Chapter 3 of the book is for fellow journalists. Once a journalist, always a journalist. I'll tell you, these were things that I was stunned to learn over the last 20 years of my career after journalism. One is that there really isn't such a thing as an accidental war. Let that sink in. These guys were looking for real examples of where a war was started truly accidentally, where neither side really intended it. They just sort of slipped into this escalating spiral like a tornado, and lo and behold, you have a war. There is no example of that, including the one that everyone likes to point to the most, which is World War I. These were very deliberate decisions that were made. There were bad assumptions made. Everyone who got into World War I thought they were going to win. Everyone who got into World War I thought that it was going to be short, but no one got into World War I by accident. It did not happen that way. And so when we look at things also like the notion of a balance of power, right? We've all read or gotten to know Henry Kissinger, the late great diplomat. The idea that a balance of power, it's a seductive phrase. The idea that like a balance of power means that the scales are balanced, that if everyone's equal in their power, peace will reign. These historians found that this was exactly untrue, that in fact, when 2 major powers who have differences, as we have with Beijing, when they become roughly equally matched, the odds of a war breaking out skyrocket. And in fact, it's when there's a gross disparity in power that the peace holds. So I'd recommend to you that book. You can still find old copies of it on Amazon, The Causes of War by Geoffrey Blaney. So this leads to provocation, right? It is very rare that there are cases where a country sees their neighbor getting strong and they attack because they're afraid that that neighbor will one day have more power than them. So this is sort of a preemptive kind of logic that does sometimes cause wars. In the case of Taiwan, Taiwan has no pretension of wanting to invade mainland China. And so if you look at how peaceful things were when the U.S. had a clear, massive, overwhelming advantage militarily over China, things were actually going pretty well. That was the 90s. That was the early 2000s. That was the 1980s, when no one would question whether or not the United States would prevail in a conflict over Taiwan, for example. Now that we're roughly getting close to being equally matched in that part of the world, suddenly Beijing is saying, we want you out. We want the United States out of the region. We want to take Taiwan because we have the capability now to take Taiwan. So actually, we would not be provoking a conflict by showing Beijing that actually the cost of war would be very, very high for Beijing. Those steps we need to undertake urgently. That's our best chance at sustaining peace. I'm, as you said, a former Marine. People who fought in wars, I don't know a single one who wants to get into another war. I've never met a veteran of a war who thinks we should aim to try to get into another war or take steps that would increase the probability that we get into a war. By the same token, I have never met a veteran of a war who believes that the way to maintain the peace over a situation like Taiwan is to be kind of meek and retiring and to say, well, geez, maybe we're offending them. Maybe our military presence is provocative and offensive. We need to back off. I don't know people who have military experience who think that that's the recipe for peace. And in fact, I think we're seeing this play out. This is what happened with Ukraine. President Biden, I know that this was well-meaning, but when he came into office, I'm not making this as a political point. I'm making this as a strategic point. President Biden stopped the flow of American weapons to Ukraine. He halted it. He thought that that would send a message of goodwill to Vladimir Putin. Do we think that Vladimir Putin interpreted that as goodwill now? That was the cause. That was one of the things that contributed to his calculus that I can get away with it. And when you're talking about bullies like Jianying is talking about, people who are actually a bit cowardly but a bit cunning and actually are, this is what bullies are. When they think they can get away with it, they're going to frickin' go. That's what we're dealing with. Now it's an axis.
Getting back to provocation, because I think it's a so getting back to
amply provoked.
Yeah, no, but look, it's a free country. People have a right, but people also have a right to be able to hear, and these people are not here to be interrupted. It's a good question to ask because we can't be self-righteous. It's conceivable we're making mistakes too. It's conceivable it's not 100% China's fault, and we have a duty, both in terms of policy and diplomacy and world peace, to keep asking ourselves that question. And I ask it, but I honestly feel we're not provoking China, even though the perception may be in some quarters. Let me take the three complaints that Xi and the Chinese leaders would have about the U.S. Number one, we're trying to undermine their regime, change their political system. Number two, we're trying to keep them down economically and in terms of world governance. And number three, we're trying to hem them in with alliances and military forces and so on. I don't want to take a long time. We ought to have more time for other people. But first, yes, I would love to have that regime change, but America's not. We're not the CIA operating in Central America. I mean, we're not doing that to China. The example of our system, if we had a better system, would undermine them. And democracy has its appeal. You've got a democracy in Taiwan, which is Chinese, partly Chinese, I should say. And by the way, reason people were somewhat optimistic during engagement is because in South Korea and Taiwan, Indonesia, Chile, once you get a middle class and the economy builds up, man or woman does not live by bread alone. They began to make political demands, and China's defied history. It's the one area where they got rich, but they didn't start opening up in their own self-interest and their own economic interest, in my opinion. So I honestly don't think we can be accused of trying to overthrow their government. Biden has made that especially clear, as have other leaders, but of course words don't persuade them. Secondly, we let them in the WTO. They had a huge trade surplus with us, so I could go on and on about how we haven't tried to keep them down economically. Right now we're responding in selective ways, de-risk rather than decouple, but I would argue that's a reaction. And then thirdly, I think that China's own treatment of its neighbors, whether it's India or whether it's the Philippines or whether it's Japan or the East or the South China Seas, that has provoked a reaction. So I would argue it's a fair question. I'm sure we have made mistakes. I'm not sure we have to fly quite so many surveillance flights near their territory. You would know as a military man whether what we get out of that militarily is worth it in terms of, because it is an awful lot of stuff going right near their borders. But on the whole, I would say we have not been provocative, and China has.
Well, you know, we could go on, and I want to thank you all for your indulgence. I think it's part of the American experiment that people do pop up at occasions like this and express themselves in untoward ways. And thank you for your indulgence. And Matt, thank you for coming. Zoe, Jianying, and Winston, as ever. It's good we can have these kinds of conversations. It's necessary that we have them. And it kind of breaks my heart to see people who throw stones at them and make it more difficult to have civilized conversations. But then any of us who come from campuses know that this is not unique to the Asia Society. It is, alas, a malady that has spread aloft in the land in general. But thank you all for being here, and thank you for coming. And